please welcome Dr. Stephanie McGuckin.
Bear with me, I might kick my shoes off at some point. So I'm going to talk about manuscripts related. Can everyone hear me? Is this okay? Got this, it should work. Related to the books and something that you might have noticed in the show but not know what the manuscript is. So start here. So basically I'm going to take us through the making of a manuscript, some key terms, things I might say that you might not quite know what I'm talking about. I do that, I apologize. Then I'm going to take you through various manuscripts that I think might be in the Bishop Clermont or de Clermont libraries. So you'll see some of the stuff that I'm actually working on at the moment, which includes this manuscript and this manuscript. But you'll also see some old familiar friends. So it is a crash course. I'm going to go fairly quickly. So hold questions at the end. I've left time for that. You can also reach out later if something comes to mind. So, making a manuscript. I'm going to start with this little comment. Give everyone a few seconds to read it. Right? So, I love this because it speaks to so much about manuscripts. I predominantly work in Insular and Anglo-Saxon art, so Book of Kells, the Beowulf Manuscript, that sort of thing, and they're covered in fiddly bits, which I think is a technical term, at least in my writing, it totally is. But it also reminds us that there is a human element to these manuscripts. They are made by hand, quite literally. They're coming from animal skin, so parchment or vellum. Later, sort of 15th, 16th centuries, we might start seeing paper. For the most part, it's skin on skin. And there is an element of divinely inspired art to some of these, in fact, quite a lot of them, especially the Insular. We're going to talk about how you show God later. So manuscripts, folio, that's the page. So if I talk about a folio, I'm talking about a page. But the folios are known as either recto, which is the front or the right-hand side, or verso, which is the back, the reverse. Traditionally, you'll see like 12V, so that would be folio number 12, the back of it. And snakes, because we all love our snakes, these are page weights that we use to hold open the manuscript. Usually we keep them towards the side. Usually I forget to grab one when I get my manuscripts and then have to go back like 30 seconds later and be like, can I have a snake? So this is just some of the technical. This one's actually paper, and this is a very loose binding. You can tell that because there are literally pages falling out. It's also one of my favorite manuscripts. Pricking and ruling. This is how we divide a page for either text or image. So you can see here, does everyone see these faint red lines? Okay, so this is how they knew where to write the line, because it's animal skin, so it's not lined. You also get pricking, and this is usually done with an instrument to guarantee space, and it can be anywhere except down the center of the page. Unless the monk went a little crazy, they sometimes do that. All right, so this is where we get to the really fun stuff with manuscripts, in my opinion. So hair and flesh side. So you've gotten your old goat who's died, you've scraped the fur off the hair. This is what you're left with sometimes. So these little individual prick-looking things here are actually hair follicles. This is worm damage. You get lots of holes in manuscripts. Sometimes it's because something has eaten it. Sometimes it's because when you put it on the stretcher and you stretch the skin to get it taut, it sort of just tears in the center. When this happens, sometimes they'll cut around it. So this is the edge of an animal. And this is from about 1500. I just brought it for fun. I had it, why not? And then you sometimes see that they're stitched, and they can be quite beautiful embroidery techniques that you'll see with those. But the other thing that I love about manuscripts is the sound they make. So if this goes to plan, you'll get to hear what a late 12th century manuscript sounds like, and you get to see me turning the page. So let's see if I can make this work. That's the binding there at the end. So that is, you see these, you sometimes don't know, they don't sound like actual books that we're familiar with. And each manuscript actually has a slightly different sound based on the binding, the materials that are used. It's quite fun to play with that. No, I don't need that again. Okay, so the pigments that are used, all of these except for cochineal are quite common in the medieval period. Cochineal comes in sort of 17th, 18th century, so if you think of British redcoats, this is actually the dye that was used in them. But the rest of these are very, very common. This one is poisonous, so just avoid. Actually, lead white, which is a common one as well, during the Tudor period was used as the foundation for makeup. So yeah, we don't always think this through. The rest of these are, these along here are natural. Verdigris is made from a copper alloy, and you just scrape it after it's been submerged in vinegar for a while. It's not this batch, but we have a batch that a friend of mine made. So there are other pigments. There are silver and gold, and these are my personal favorite pigments. If you know me, you know I like shiny things, also if you can't tell from what I'm wearing. And gold and silver both shine. The downside to silver is it tarnishes. So sometimes it looks like black pigment. When I was in the British Library a couple weeks ago looking at some manuscripts that I'm working on, there was silver in it, and I lost my mind because no one's realized it. I see a couple people who got texts that were nonsensical for me about this laughing, because it really happened. But this is what gold looks like, or at least late gold. So it does shine, and if you're ever in a church, see if they'll turn the lights off or go when the lights aren't on later in the evening when it's just candlelight, because that's the actual atmosphere we should be seeing these in. We don't, looking at them in a library or on screen is hard because they should be flickering. There's a 3D sort of part to manuscripts even when there's not the silver and gold. When we've got the silver and gold, it's very sparkly. Right, so the library. Let's start with okay, a French Bible. I think we can all agree Matthew would have owned at least one. Probably a lot. But this is an early 14th century Bible. It's a French translation of the Vulgate as well as some scholastic material alongside. Gerrit de Melon was a canon who translated all of this. These are huge Bibles. This is a third of what survives in this manuscript, so this is one volume. This was me sitting down to take this photo. To actually see part of it, I had to stand up because it was about this big. The other fun part of this manuscript is it's one of 144 that survive. Only about 11 are not illustrated, and they are blingy. So naturally, I liked them. But one of the things that happens when you're looking at these in real life is you have a set of research questions. Sometimes they're quite broad, sometimes they're quite specific. This one I was like, Matthew clearly had a Bible in French, duh. I had no idea what I was getting in for with this manuscript. I'd also missed the part where this was 3 volumes. So they're like, we've just brought the first volume up for you, and I'm like, oh, perfect, that's what I wanted. No, but yeah, it was Genesis. I worked on Genesis imagery. So this is Gerrit translating, writing. It's a very common image of your scribe. But then I turn the page. But I'm just going to draw your attention to something. So do you see this gold pattern? Right, this is what we expect for an early 14th century manuscript. Hold that in your head. So I go through Genesis because that's my favorite Bible, because there's a lot of nudity in it. No lies, that's why it was in my PhD. And I start realizing something's up with God. Now, the gold blob, that's fine. There is always a debate in the Middle Ages about how you depict God. Insular manuscripts do this with Greek letters and the wonderful fiddly bits we all love. Some people choose not to. Some will just have the hand coming from the frame. So there's a lot here. So I'm thinking, okay, so they don't want to show God, so they just show gold. Fair enough. Then I get to this image over here. And I'm like, cool, we just have a gold background because the artist got lazy. What's happening? So I just keep going. Creation, more gold, more God. I get to this one and I go, no, this is later. Everyone see the little hand sticking out here? Showing through. This is a later artist coming into this manuscript and painting over God. Another clue to this is you turn the page, they missed this one, they just defaced him. But on the later, we've got another gold god. So they didn't run out of gold, they just missed him? I don't know. But I'm taking through one that was even more sort of startling. So we're gonna go back through here. Does everyone see the little hand here? Yeah. So once you know that it's there and you know to look for it, it suddenly just leaps off and you're like, how did I miss that 15 minutes ago? You also see the difference in gold. So can you see that it's not patterned, it doesn't have the same quality as the leaf, so this is a different gold here as well. So you can see the lights hitting them differently. But this day, I was sitting next to the window, which meant I had a light source. And when I held up the folio slightly awkwardly against the window, not against it, I could see what was underneath it. It's like a gold palimpsest. I got really excited because this wasn't in the catalog. And one of my friends in the archives in Edinburgh is a cataloger, and I just called her over and I'm like, am I hallucinating? And she's like, no, you're not. So we go to this slide, and you can see God. You can see it. He's probably gold because the skin tone just is showing through as the gold because there's not much paint there. But this is what it's like to work in a library. You just don't know what's going to happen. I don't think Matthew's manuscript's going to have a later edition like this for various reasons, but this is it. So, witchy manuscripts. Just going to blanket statement, these are not spell books. These are manuscripts that I think a witch or someone like Martha would be interested in. Now, the first of these is a herbal. And herbals have been around since the Assyrians and ancient Egyptians. But it's really the 4th century BCE Greek ones that are the predecessors to the medieval ones from the West. This is just a fun Anglo-Saxon one, because the Anglo-Saxons like throwing in things like this, and I think it's pretty, so. But these are both from Ashmole's collection. And this is actually the woad plant. Now, does anyone have any familiarity with woad? Okay, so some of you do. So those of you that do, is this woad? Can you tell? No. Well, actually, I love it because the leaves are blue, which happens right before you need to harvest it for the pigment. The joints, the vines, are sometimes blue as well. So you have these little illustrations combined with the text that are meant to aid you. They're not a field book as such. But we go and look at actual woad, and this is all woad that I grew with the Edinburgh Medieval Pigment Project. And you can see, so the leaves are about that color, this is a seed. You can see it's sort of a blue-purple. Behind me, this is the color that it dyes. So the really weird thing with woad is it actually comes out this, I don't know if you can see this little bit of yellow. This is straight out of the vat before it's been oxidized. And as it sort of dries, it gets darker and darker. So it's a bit of a guessing game when you pull it out. But that is that one. During Tudor times, Elizabeth actually issued a proclamation against the growing of woad because people were growing it by such quantities instead of growing food crops. It also destroys the soil very quickly, so you have to be very careful. And it also takes at least 2 years to mature to get any form of pigment. So it's a very interesting persnickety thing. So this is one of my favorite Anglo-Saxon manuscripts. It's Bald's Leech Book. Now the fiddly bits in this are the Old English. It's not illustrated except for some capitals that are a little bit decorated. So has anyone heard of this manuscript? It was in the news a few years ago. Okay, a couple of you. So this is one that we like to test out the eye salve and different remedies every so often. A few years ago, a team at the University of Nottingham decided to test out this recipe, and this is it in Old English. This is it in translation. And what they found was when you follow this sort of as close to the letter as you can, so the right ratios, the brass thing, it actually is a really good cure for MRSA. And some of their batches actually cured it at a higher rate than some of the modern medicines. So this is really interesting because it tells us that these remedies and things a fairly straightforward one. You do get some weirder ones. Are not just superstition. They're a sort of early medieval science where they're looking at the elements, they're combining, they know their landscape, and they are changing their remedies or doing them for a reason. So what might sound like superstition to us, especially when it says something like under the moon or at moontide, is actually there's a reason because they've observed something in their landscape. My personal favorite line of this is the scribe who tells us it's the best medicine. I mean, Anglo-Saxons were making dick jokes, so of course they're making these comments. Okay, so wonders of the East and bestiaries. Who has heard of the wonders of the East? Just sort of, okay, that was like 3 hands. Well, you're all about to hear about it. So you can think of these as an early bestiary. This one, we have 3 versions of it that are illustrated from Anglo-Saxon England, which was the high point. They are creatures, animals, and descriptions of them. So, just worth noting, I'm assuming more people have heard of Beowulf. Okay, so this is in the Beowulf manuscript. Beowulf is not alone in that manuscript by any means. And you can see here the burn. This was in the Cotton collection, which forms the basis of the British Library's medieval collections. And in 1731, it was all being housed in Ashburnham House, which is just not a good name, guys, because it caught fire. Yeah, and we lost a few things. We have a few bits that are basically ash and little charred remains, like we're talking like pieces as small as just the bit I'm circling. And we're able to start putting them back together to recreate these. But this is one of the manuscripts that was damaged and pulled. So if we had lost this manuscript, we would have lost Beowulf. So this manuscript's important for several reasons. But we have little beasts here. So this is the Donestra. It likes to eat humans. It speaks human. That's what the manuscript says, is it knows human speech. It lures you in, it then eats you, and then once it's eaten you, when it's full, it weeps over your remains. So it sort of, you know, when we go and we eat too much, that's the same thing there, guys. And then we have this lovely hen. The hen looks normal, right? Yeah, don't pick it up, it'll set you on fire. So these are the things that are happening. And then we get to the bestiaries. Now, these are fun. There's some suggestion that these might have actually been for women. Some of the earliest have inscriptions dedicating them to female patrons. The other thing that tells us that some of these that aren't dedicated or don't have the inscriptions are for women is the fact that there's a higher number of female figures, both human and animal, in these. So we have our little mother hedgehog who feeds her children by knocking grapes off the vine. Once they're on the ground, rolls over them, they stick to their quills, and then she goes back home. So you get really cute little stories with these. But we also all know the Griffin. And so this is Deb's comment here, and this is Isidore's basis. So we have our eagle head and our lion's body. Just figured I'd throw in a few of these. Also, my favorite part of Isidore is they also tear humans apart when they see them. So, like, can you imagine being Diana and you suddenly have a griffin? Like, oops. So this is another one, a slightly later drawing. The British Library's medieval manuscripts actually tweeted another image from this manuscript last night. So if you don't follow them, do. They're really good. So this is a later manuscript, but I just wanted to bring it in. It's a composite manuscript of Virgil's poetry, but it's a good example of what happens. So as books of hours fall out of use and popularity, their images get pushed to the margins. This is especially true for books of hours, which for the sake of time I took out, so I'll tweet some of those pictures later. But what happens is they go into the margins. And they carry some of the same meaning. So here we have our pelican piercing its breast to feed its young. This stands for Christ, who shed his blood to save your lives. It's salvation imagery. The ever-lovely mermaid, who is a sign of vanity. So she's got her mirror. And then the peacock here, who is a sign of paradise. So you still get these meanings that are called up partly because they've been spread through the bestiary and other animal texts. So, alchemical manuscripts, and this is when I have to go to my cheat sheets because I don't memorize all of my primary sources. I know, it's a shock. start with this one. Does anyone recognize this manuscript? Because you should. If you've seen season 1, you should recognize this. Okay, maybe it's just because I do manuscripts. So this is one of the ones Diana reads. I think this is the one she just leaves open and walks out of the library declaring it's time to get a drink, which my PhD supervisor, upon seeing that episode, declared that's how she was going to leave libraries from then on. I know several people that if that was our option, we probably would. Okay, so this is one of the earliest alchemical texts, and one of the most important. This is a donor portrait, basically. But I just wanted to, give praise to the art team once again, because this is it next to the actual manuscript that's in the British Library. So you can see they're changing little bits, but they are really trying to maintain an authenticity with these manuscripts. Just don't smack one, please. That does cause a little, heart palpitations. But I just wanted to throw this in. But I'm mostly going to talk about my favorite alchemical manuscript, which you might recognize from last year, because I did mention it. And this is MS Ferguson 6 from Glasgow Uni. And it is an alchemical miscellany. It has everything you'd expect from alchemical vessels and drawings, which is what we see with earlier imagery. And then we get to allegorical images. And this is of mercury, as my helpful label tells you. The first time I saw this, I was very confused. But so mercury, mercurius, is of course the prime material for alchemy. So everything that you need to know about the process is in this image. Yeah? You think you could do alchemy from this? I couldn't. But mercury is also known as Hermes. Here's our staff of Hermes. It's the joining of Sol and Luna. So we have these. We get the little wings, also this. But Mercury was also known as the mother to the entire system. And one source tells you it's also the stepmother. So it is the be-all and end-all. This is your first and last step in the process. So then we get to the Auroric Insurgents. Now this is one of the most popular allegorical texts and image sets. Now what's really interesting about this one is it's not written out. So we don't have the text. We just have the illustrations, which is interesting because that's not normally what ends up happening. But this, if you have ever seen the Splendor Solace images, I know Deb shared a few of them, this matches it very close. And the scribe, the artist that's working on this particular manuscript, knows other manuscripts as well as the printed volume. So he's sort of combining and changing, which it leads to weird things happening sometimes. But then we get wisdom. And one of the things that's really interesting about alchemical imagery is so much of it is drawn from Christian imagery. So this is the mother of mercy. So Mary, normally is the one bringing her, all the sinners under her cloak. Well, actually here, it's wisdom, getting all of her little alchemists to come to her. She also feeds them with breast milk. This is when I get really excited, guys. I'm not gonna lie, I literally have to finish writing an article on breastfeeding soon. But this is based on images of wisdom. Mary, ecclesia, the church, is sometimes shown feeding its young. So we did this, but I just wanted to bring in some images of breastfeeding. So the virgin lactans is one of the most common images that we see in books of hours, especially those associated with women. The other thing that we get, and this is going to be me geeking out for a few seconds, this is from the Psychomachia manuscript. And this is a 4th century text, I get my dates wrong, that tells the battle of the soul, that occurs in the soul of the vices and the virtues. So this is a vice. This is also one of the very few, and by few I mean you could count them on less than one hand, images from Anglo-Saxon England of breastfeeding. So normally we would expect this to have positive connotations because of the virgin. This is actually greed, feeding her other children. And the text tells us that this is black milk, and I love this manuscript because they made the nipples darker to tell you that this is black. So this is an inversion of life-giving milk. This is death-causing milk if you suffer from this. So this is all sort of contained in this, more related to this than this. I just love this image. So that's what's happening there in nursing. And there's also a lot of milk overtones in the process, and I'll talk about some of those in a minute. So we go through, we also have the wonderful menstruating child. Give me one second, I'm trying to find the quote that goes with this one. All right, so the text, not in this manuscript, from a different manuscript, tells us, "For 3 months water preserveth or nourisheth the fetus in the womb, ere nourisheth it for the second 3. Fire also guardeth it for the third 3. The infant will never come to birth until these months are expired." So some actually have this as a 12-month process, which is what you've got here. But that's why you have her menstruating in the middle of a zodiac sign. So it's all of this about birth and the life cycle of the stone as well as women. Right, so we're going to skip from a different manuscript to another one that I just kind of enjoy because it's fun. So this is your first image in it. Then we turn, and these are all details, and they're in order of the alchemical process, but they're not necessarily in order from the manuscript. So I've jumped around towards the end of the cycle to show you more complete, because there's about 5 or 10 folios where it's like this in 14 different forms. So I pulled in some of the dragons because I thought people would appreciate dragons. So this is your first one. So Mercurius, this is Mercurius again, but another version of it. So you see we've got our Sol and Luna again, we have our bird, our 6-pointed star, which represents the culmination of earth and heaven, life and death. And there's always some sort of weird meaning. So this is the green lion, just go with me here. And this is the unclean matter of the stone. So this is very early on in the process. So then we come along here. So we're moving, this is the 4 elements, all in one, and our pelican again. So this is now the stone, a young stone, because we're trying to get the stone redder so that it's complete. The other thing I want to point out, does everyone see this little dot? So this is from the compass that was used to make these circles. So you can actually see it. And if we go back, you can see it here too. So this is how they're making their circles. And I love when we get little hints of this. And then we have our nice little dragon conjunction eating itself. And so this is always symbols of death. So sometimes you get birds or dragons or snakes fighting each other. Sometimes they're fighting each other and having sex at the same time. Again, life and death all in one image. That is what the Ouroboros is. So then fermentation, so this is getting towards the end of it. And this is key when fire is key. So we have our little dragon and all the fire. I also love how our colors change here. We're starting to get more of the red. We're getting closer. And these are coming from the final pages of this manuscript. And then here, our multiplication is the penultimate stage. So our dragon's a bit more mature, but we're having to go through this process again and again and again. Alchemy is very circular and redundant. So sometimes the images do this as well. But the other thing that I find really interesting about this is, so you've got this yellow blob here, right? So we know in some of the texts it says to add saffron, and the saffron will spread out. And this is part of the process. So I think this is what they're representing here with the circle, is they're trying to clue you in to things, because this text has no text. It's just the images and sort of the little captions we have. And then finally, we get to our stone, who is shown as a child. This is the mature stone, the mature elixir. You can see, again, these faint lines from the compass marks, but we can't really see the center because it's so illustrated. And the other thing, going back to the breastfeeding and the menstruation, the vessels were known, these alembics were also known as the womb. So this is literally, we're looking into the womb for the mature child before it's born. And on the next folio of this actually is just the angel baby thing standing there. So this is our final step in the alchemy. So that's where I'm going to stop. We've got some fun pictures for the end. Also, they're having sex. My favorite from this manuscript, or from MS Ferguson 6, there's one where they're lying on top of each other like this, but he's actually grabbing her boob. It's like a little foreplay before you get into like the proper copulation to mature the stone. It's these little details that bring these to life. So now I think we have some time for questions. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, so who wants to start us off? This one out.
Most of the monks who were making the manuscripts, did they have one, like how long would it take? Was it like your entire life's work to just do one manuscript?
So it depends. So I should say early on it is monks, but sort of towards the later medieval period we start seeing workshops. Paris is a great example of this. where you have non-monks and people producing them. So books of hours and things like that happens. And it depends on the manuscript. So something like the Book of Kells or the Codex Amiatinus, probably there's some debate as to whether it's one scribe or four, but it depends on seasons. I always hate to give a time, but we're talking, several years in the earlier. You might get faster later, and there's also a division of labor within art and text in some of them. One of the manuscripts I work on, we've always assumed it's the same guy doing all of it because in the prologue, in the dedication, which has names in the 10th century day, says, Ethelwald commanded me, Godman, to make many arches and just lists everything that you then find in the manuscript. It's wonderful. And that's a blingy manuscript. It's amazing. I love it. But yeah, so it depends. Sorry, that's not a more specific answer, but it depends on the manuscript.
That was very interesting. Thank you.
Oh, we've got someone else.
Hello, thank you. That was really interesting. Can I be cheeky and ask two questions?
Yeah, of course you can.
You said that the silver often appears black.
Yes.
How do you, when you're studying, tell the difference?
Okay, so this is a good example from the manuscripts I was just looking at. So sometimes we miss it, and it takes someone else seeing it. But one of the things silver does is it eats through the page, so that's one thing. So sometimes you'll see it. Sometimes you'll get little glimpses. So the Psychomachia ones that I was looking at 2 weeks ago, I thought the capitals of each line of poem started with a red letter, but some of them were gray. And I was like, what is going on here? Because I don't know. Excuse me. And then I realized some of them have gray on the red. And then I realized, oh, it's flaking like I'd expect a shell gold to flake. And then I went and I just sort of was like, can I put some raking light on this 1,000-year-old manuscript? Is that cool? And the librarian's like, I have a light box. And I was like, yes. So I used a light box and I was able to get the light to hit some of the silver, which was still shining. So that's one way. Tests, when we can do them, will sometimes reflect the light. Others, so the one that I showed there, you can still see some of the silver. So it ranges on the type of silver and what they've done to it, but it's manuscript specific, but anything from you just luck out and get the light right to, oh, what's weird about this one, to something's bleeding through, to one manuscript that I just learned about, actually they mixed it with the gold because in the text that they were illustrating, it described the combination of silver and gold, so they did it, which meant it all tarnished, except for very few flakes of gold. And then they were able, because I think it's in the Walters, to do some of the testing, and we're like, oh, it's silver. So it's sort of questioning when we see black, is it black? And if it deteriorates differently from the other manuscript, black, then there's something going on there. And it could be that it's just black, but it could be that something, the Psychomachia, the letters come through on the other side, which was another clue.
Also, you said some of the paints were toxic.
Yeah.
Was it dangerous for people working with them? I imagine the illustrators licking their finger and turning the page.
No, definitely. There was a huge news recently because someone found lapis lazuli in the teeth of a skull, and then it was a female skull, and everyone got really excited because it's like it's evidence of a female artist, and those of us that work on women in art were like, really? We've been telling you this for decades, but you come on, guys. But yeah, so definitely. And some of the pigments are actually arsenic-based. And so there's one that I use in workshops that is a derivative of arsenic. And I also I have to basically scare my students because just don't do anything except paint. But yeah. Some of them are edible, but hey, not the arsenic one. Oh, what? Oh, okay.
Hi. Have you ever found an illustration that you were surprised to find in the text that you were studying?
Not that I was surprised to find the illustration. Usually it's something in the illustration that I'm surprised by. So for example, the breastfeeding and the Psychomachia. I'm not surprised to find it. I'm surprised to realize that it's one of 2 texts in Anglo-Saxon England that are illustrated that show breastfeeding. So it's that sort of thing. It's never necessarily an image catches me off guard. It's an image that I expect to be something that isn't what I would expect because of a pattern.
So it's not like you find an illustration and you say, why did they put this here?
Sometimes because they put things in weird places, or they punctuate the text differently. If we've got several of these, where the images fall might be different to another manuscript. But I haven't found anything weird in that sense. I mean, I found loads of weird stuff. Also, if you're
Sure you
bored
have.
and you want to play on the digitization of the Book of Kells, count the penises. You wouldn't expect it there, but they are there. So you get that sort of joking behavior as well. But yeah, so it's a yes, no, manuscript dependent. Yeah, I was going to say there are some sort of everywhere.
I wanted to ask a question about what dictates the size of the manuscripts. One that you mentioned, the Codex Amiatinus, I saw that, and it's absolutely enormous, and I wondered why that was.
Because it's the Bible. That's a cheeky answer, but because it's the complete Bible.
Okay.
And it's just big. So I love the Codex Amiatinus. I'm an Anglo-Saxonist. So when it was at the British Library, I cannot tell you how many scholars on my Twitter feed were like, oh my God, it's big. Because we all knew it was big, like we knew. And then you walk in and you see it, and it's like up to my knee big. And I'm like, without these shoes on, but probably close to them on. And I was like, Jesus, it's huge. And the great thing about the Codex Amiatinus is it's one of several copies. So we have some leaves from another, and it was there's some connections to the papacy, but it is a medieval complete Bible, and that's why. Normally we have the 4 Gospels together, or a Psalter together, or a hexateuch or a heptateuch together. It's very rare to get the complete thing because it is so big. Again, these are handwritten objects. So when you get tiny lettering, that's your scribe having to produce that. And some scribes can write smaller than other scribes and it still be legible. Some scribes can't write at all, but we still love them. But so it's that sort of thing, and it's the materiality. A piece of parchment is going to be thicker than a piece of paper. That it's just how it works. And then when you put the entire Bible together, that's why. And that's actually from goat skin, by the way. We're just proving it's goat. And some of it's old goat. So I like to picture like the joke about like, you know your goat and then it dies. Like, is that a compliment to your goat to make it into the Bible? Like, like it's silly, but these are the sort of questions that scholars are starting to ask is sort of, do you recognize your goat, friend? Because, you know, it carried things to market for how many years? So there's such a like animal human skin element. And I get really geeky about this with Discovery of Witches because it's one of the amazing things of we have a manuscript that doesn't approve of how it's being treated in the show, and it burns her. Like, that is the manuscript being like, you don't smack me. Like, it is literally, it's punishing her for this action, amongst other things, and it's amazing. I will eventually publish those ideas at some point.
Thank you.
Hopefully this isn't a silly question, but could this be considered the precursor to chemistry?
Okay, so I've got so many theories on this. I have suspicions about the pigments used in ashmole coming from different creature types. Yes, the manuscripts are skin, but why couldn't the binding be creature hair? Why the alchemical process yields silver and gold? How do we know it's not a weaver blood and a vampire blood giving the silver and gold pigment of the manuscript? So yeah, creature chemistry all over this, and I think we're getting more biology today from Shelley than chemistry, but yeah, there's definitely some of that in there.
Cool.
I've just got a question. With the church, what was the church's take on alchemy? Because obviously some people thought it was witchcraft.
So it's a mixed relationship, like everything related to the church in the period. So some people actually refused to print the text because they found it profane. So a lot of the texts, especially things like the Law of Insurgents, are drawing on the Song of Songs, which is it's a sexy text, guys, if you haven't read it. It's amazing. It's very sensual, very sexy. And so these things are getting borrowed and pulled into the alchemical text, and they're like, whoa, that text is about like the bridegroom, getting it on with the church. Like, maybe we shouldn't be using that for science. So it's mixed, but I mean, you had patrons of the church. So it's one of these things that it depends on the text, it depends on the person, the context. You've definitely got learned monks using some of this, or canons doing some of this, and we have those connections. So it's a bit of everything. One of them starts out, a monk of somewhere wrote this text. So it's sort of hard to say, like, I think at one point the church is like, no alchemy, and everyone's like, whatevs. And they keep doing it. In fact, they do at one point. So yeah, so you just ignore the church and do what you want. That's what they've been doing for, 2,000 years now.
Hi, I've studied calligraphy, and trying to get every letter exactly the same size and exactly the same direction is really, really hard. Yeah. And in this day and age where there's papers readily available, I have sheaves and sheaves of reams of practice papers. Is there any evidence that they had something to practice on? Because presumably vellum was incredibly expensive.
It was usually wax tablets. They're practicing on wax tablets. For some of the interlace, we actually had bone carvings that survive, and you can see them working out the mathematics of the interlace. I know some of those are at the National Museum of Scotland. That's where I know the collection the best, so I've seen. But yeah, so we do have evidence of that. But a lot of it doesn't survive because it's wax tablets or clay tablets. You also get these beautiful moments in manuscripts where the scribe, because they're copying a text, just skips this thing, and then they try to squeeze it into the margins, or they write it below as if nothing happened. So you're reading it and you're suddenly like, wait, what? Or they put little manicules, so little pointers, being like, this should go here. Or you get someone changing letters because that person didn't understand the paleography of the other hand they're copying, which makes me feel really good when I can't read something. But yeah, so yeah. You didn't just pick up a thing and start writing, or illustrating, or playing with gold. And I will have, this is from Manuscript of Music that I just found, the single folio, and I'll have it with me today. So if you grab me and I have it, I'm happy to show it to you.
Hi. Over the years, I've seen many artists and people writing doodling in the margins just out of, they don't realize they're often doing it. And I was just wondering, has anyone, like someone working in cement or brickwork or paint, signed their name when they're not supposed to decide and say, I was here, or just doodled in the middle of a manuscript and not realize they've done it and thought, oh my God, I hope the abbot doesn't see it?
I don't know if we can say that they didn't know that they were doing it, because quite often you will get that. They might doodle something in the margins. A colleague of mine, good friend actually, I can't remember which library she was in, it's been a few years. She was just going through, as you do, and had realized that someone had taken with the dry point, which is what they'll sometimes draw the images with, because it doesn't show once you've done it, like faces and stuff in the margins. But it was one of these things that you had to have the trick of the light to even pick it up. So yeah, it happens. Sometimes you'll get inscriptions of ownership, which is very common later, and those tend to be, so-and-so picked this up somewhere in the 17th century. So we do get it, but it's different than sort of a thing. I'd say it's more akin to, when you get your favorite book and you write your name in it, I'd say it's more akin to that, or you have a scribe saying, I so-and-so made this. If it's bad, I'm sorry, I'm just a humble scribe. That's men and women doing that, and then you get the Godman example that's like, yo, Ethelwald told me to do it because I'm flashy. So you get all these lovely little hubris and fake humility with them, and then you do get sometimes marginal, and sometimes it's where the manuscript was, not necessarily who was reading it. So we are always looking for these things, and we're always finding them just because they're easy to miss.
Hi, a question, is there or are there differences between manuscripts from different countries? So let's say, would there be a difference in the illustrations or the text compared to something originating from UK compared to, let's say, France or Germany?
Oh yeah. So there are different styles that come about. So again, I'm going to jump back here to stuff that I know very intimately. so my Psychomachia manuscripts are copied from continental exemplars. And the Anglo-Saxons go, we really like these, but we're going to change a few things. So like, we're going to get ourselves into trouble because we're going to change the genders and then realize that was a bad idea. So yeah, so there's that. A good example of this is French manuscripts. So the Bible, it's a very French Gothic style that comes into England slightly later. So yeah, you can tell when you're working on a certain type where they were from. And the alchemy ones are, you can to some extent, and that tends to be because this is when we're seeing more and more vernaculars. So that gives you a clue of what vernacular it's written in, but that's also not always indicative. Sometimes you've got Old English being produced on the continent and vice versa, so you do have to be careful, but yeah, you can.
Can I ask how you choose what, it sounds like you're discovering Easter eggs, like in Deb's books, when you pick up a manuscript. And like Diana making notes on Ashmore 782 of folios missing, what you find might not be pertinent to what you're looking for in your research project. So how do you share those little Easter eggs with people, like with your colleagues, that might be useful for what they're researching, but you won't necessarily know that?
Conferences, attendance at conferences, publications. So the Psychomachia stuff is a monograph I'm developing based on a case study in my PhD, and an article that should be out very soon that hints at some of the very kernels of this. But it's conversations, it's academic publications, it's academic conferences, it's Twitter, strangely enough. As soon as I saw the gold, I DM'd one of my friends that works on a lot of Anglo-Latin poetry, and I was like, you've seen a lot more of these than I have. Have you noticed this silver thing? And she's like, I'm writing a conference paper for this thing, but off the top of my head, no, I'll get back to you. So it's those sorts of conversations. It's mentioning it in catalogs, you know, it's sending emails and saying, hey, this isn't mentioned in the catalog, it might be worth saying. Academia is slow. Publications are slow. So it's really the conference level where a lot of this comes out. And quite often these accidental finds do tell us about what we're asking. So one of my questions for these manuscripts is, who's looking at them? I'm interested in gender, so what's doing that? Well, I've got silver, so automatically I'm having to look high status now because of the costs. Or is this just something coming from the continent? So it's telling me something about the creation, which will then tell me something about my actual research questions. So it's sort of using the information you have to answer the questions. But also, and this is something I had to learn in my PhD, is sometimes the manuscript doesn't do what you think it should do. And it's not going to tell you what you want it, and you have to figure out what it's saying. So you have to say, okay, suddenly I'm now dealing with something else about these. The Old English Haxatuke I love and hate equally, because I was like, you're going to tell me something about gender, and it's like, I am, but not what you want to know. So it's this sort of thing that you really, I'm personifying these manuscripts, but they have an agency in scholarship that, you know, they tell us their secrets, and if we're looking at the right time or we have the right light, we see them. So it's very sort of mysterious, but it is. But my notes look very much like Diana's. I sit there and I type, and I will, if it's digitized, we'll sometimes have the digitizations printed out and make notes on the page so that my note that says, weird thing here, I've scribbled it on a digitization so that I know visually what it looks like as well.
Okay. So when you're starting to look at manuscripts, I'm thinking of sort of these as kind of early portraiture, early paintings, in the same vein as like you would have certain of the old masters who would have trained a kind of group and they would have studied with him. Do you tend to see across all of the manuscripts that you do that there are certain monasteries or certain scribes who come from particular areas or particular monasteries that tend to produce in the same way? Are they sort of, is there a style or almost like a brand?
Yeah, so definitely, and this is throughout, so we can tell sort of a Parisian illustration or illumination from one elsewhere in France for various reasons. That's technique, materials, text occasionally, but some of mine, in Anglo-Saxon England, there's two very distinct styles of illustration. One is colorful and flashy, and one is line drawing, which is somewhat colorful. Sometimes they're found together, but usually that has an iconographic significance. It's telling me something important. So in the Benediction of St. Ethelwold, there's an image that we think is of Ethelwold that's in the flashy, colorful pastel swaths of color. The rest of the image is in the line drawing. which tells us immediately the person that's important in this image is the one in Technicolor. So you get that merging and separation. So the Psychomachia ones are produced elsewhere from the Benedictional, and I know that based on the style. One of my artists in one of these manuscripts is, we know it's the same artist that worked on the second half, maybe the first half, I can never keep it straight, of another really famous manuscript, the Junius 11 Anglo-Saxon. So we can see the hands across the way. But that's a lot of guesswork as well. But yeah, you can. After you've like looked at them and then you're like, hey, I think that guy draws the same sort of ear as that guy, so they're the same guy. Yeah, we get down to ears, guys. Like, I know.
Hi, I was just wondering, and specifically the and I may not pronounce it properly, the Voynich Manuscript.
The Voynich, yes.
Yes, has there been any movement on that whatsoever, and more discovery, or?
We're constantly working on that, and there is a scholar who is definitely working on it, and I follow her on Twitter, and she's amazing because she's constantly being like, no, maybe, no, it's great. But yeah, it's one of these that we're always looking at and puzzling over, and we're still trying to get to the bottom of it. There are lots of different suggestions and theories, some of which have been constantly debunked, but that's Lisa Fagan Davis, I think is her name, that's working on those. We're good? Okay, I'm getting the time. But if you have more questions, feel free to reach out at some point this weekend or online.